Funding for this program is provided by the National Institute of Justice.
Hello, I'm James Wilson. In about a third of all suicides, half of all fatal automobile accidents, and more than half of all murders, somebody has been drinking. Alcohol is involved in the deaths of more Americans than handguns or heroin. Each year, as many as 40,000 people die a violent death in circumstances in which alcohol is implicated. In addition, a large number of spouse assaults, child abuse cases, and barroom fights occur after bouts of drinking. To say that alcohol is involved in violence does not necessarily mean that it causes it. For example, someone already planning to assault or murder may drink to get up their courage. Nor are changes in crime rates clearly linked to changes in drinking patterns. Nevertheless, there is a broad consensus that drinking is deeply involved in crime and violence.
I have very strong conviction that alcohol and criminal behavior, and particularly violent behavior, have a strong association, close association.
Jeanette Spencer bases her belief on personal experience. These days, she works in a New York correctional institution, helping prisoners with their alcohol problems. 20 years ago, she was an inmate herself, convicted of a crime she committed while drunk.
We hooked up together and we drank together, and one day I didn't have any money and he didn't have any money, and he said, well, let's go get some. And that's what we did. With alcohol, I'm capable of anything. I have no conscience. My thought processes change, and it's affected by the alcohol that I've drunk. So I could see why I wound up thinking it was normal to go into a store, you know, and take something from somebody, which was totally foreign to my personality or anything I'd ever known.
Spencer says if she hadn't been an alcoholic, she wouldn't have taken part in the robbery. Alcohol, she says, makes you do things you wouldn't otherwise do.
Whatever thought crosses their mind may very well become the act. If it's in anger, it could be assault. If it's a pretty woman that they just decide they want, that could become the rape. Because all sense of judgment and conscience is temporarily gone under the influence of alcohol.
Over the years, America has tried different approaches to curbing alcohol consumption. In the 20s, it was prohibition, followed by the view that alcohol abuse is a disease that requires medical treatment. Today, opinion is changing again. For many, the solution is to use the law to reduce the amount of drinking and to punish more severely those who commit crimes, such as vehicular homicide, while under the influence of alcohol.
Steve, this is an alcohol sobriety checkpoint. How much you had to drink?
These police officers in Montgomery County, Maryland, have set up a roadblock, stopping all cars that drive by. Those persons they suspect of drinking and driving are put through a series of tests, from reciting the alphabet, to walking a straight line, to balancing on one foot, then a simple, highly accurate test based on eye movements, and finally a portable breathalyzer.
Keep harder. Keep going now. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Okay. This shows you as an 07. Okay? 08, we would place you under arrest. Wow. That's how close you are.
If found to be under the influence of alcohol, the driver is arrested on the spot.
All right, you're under arrest. Driving while intoxicated.
Well, if it does keep someone from drinking and driving, they've served their purpose.
In addition to law enforcement measures, legislatures are enacting laws that crack down on drunk driving, restrict alcohol use by banning happy hours at bars when drinks are sold at especially low prices, raise the minimum drinking age, and restrict the right of people to bring liquor to sporting events. The question is, will these legal efforts make a difference in the toll of death and injury associated with drinking? To discuss these questions, we have Professor Mark Moore of the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, who was chairman of a committee of the National Academy of Sciences that reviewed policies toward alcohol use. Barry Swedler, director of the Bureau of Safety Programs at the National Transportation Safety Board, and Dr. Robert Niven, director of the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. Mr. Swedler, do we have any solid evidence that this get tough attitude, the crackdown on drunken driving, can in fact reduce automobile fatalities?
There is evidence that this crackdown, as you mentioned, is starting to pay off. It's going to take a long time because this crackdown has only just really begun in the last 2 or 3 years. Before that, not much progress was being made. But now that many legislatures, or almost every legislature in the United States, has toughened their laws, and the citizens now seem to be behind this big push to enforce the law more vigorously, we are starting to make progress. Not much yet, but I strongly feel that we will continue as the enforcement and the whole system is actually more attention is paid to it.
You've estimated, or others have estimated, that if I drink and then go out in my car and drive, that under ordinary circumstances the chances of my getting caught might be as low as 1 in 2,000. Given those odds, why should I worry about the get tough attitude that's sweeping the country?
Well, what we're trying to do is change the odds. One of the most important things we could do is try to generally deter the drunk driver. Not try to catch every drunk driver, because we just don't have the resources in this country for our police departments. They will never be able to catch every drunk driver. The idea is to deter people from drinking, and there are things that can be done. You talked about the roadblocks. That is definitely one thing that is proven to be effective. Another thing is swift punishment. Take away the driver's license right on the spot. Now, if the public gets that impression that there's a greater chance that they might get detected, and then if detected, punished swiftly, I think we'll start to see a big drop-off.
Well, let me look at this now from the point of view of somebody who has been caught. Suppose the public generally thinks we're cracking down, but then we look at the statistics that you, I think, have developed, which shows that in a particular study where 50 or so drunk drivers who've been involved in accidents were tested, and most of these were fatal accidents. You discovered that these 50 or so drunk drivers had accumulated hundreds of prior arrests for alcohol-related crimes and drunk driving itself, yet they were still on the road. Now, deterrence didn't work for them. What is going on here?
Well, what we tried to point out in that study was all of the loopholes that were in the system, not only at the enforcement level, but at all levels, before the person even comes in contact with the system. When they come in contact with a police officer, police officers may not even arrest those that they catch. Studies show that even people who are above the legal limit, 30% of them that are stopped by police are not even arrested.
Why is it the police are so reluctant to arrest somebody who's clearly drunk by some scientific test?
Well, in some cases they can't even detect them. In other instances, maybe police are sometimes reluctant to arrest women. They might take them home because it's a stigma. They are reluctant to arrest youth. They take them home. We've had cases where a young girl of 16 turned herself in. She said she just couldn't take it anymore because she had been picked up by police and taken home 4 or 5 times. So it's not just these things have to stop.
What about if they're arrested and if the black mark goes on their record? How automatic is it in the average state that their license will be revoked or something will happen to them that makes them feel that there is a price to pay for that?
Right now, it's not very certain that punishment will take place because of plea bargaining, because of poor record systems. The judges may not realize that this person is not just a social drinker who had went out and drove drunk the first time, but this person may have a record, and this is the 4th or 5th offense. The records are very poor. Plea bargaining comes in where, because of the courts are so overloaded, many times the defendant's attorney will bargain the offense down to a non-alcohol related offense, and all of these things contribute to a person not really getting his just due in the system.
Let me ask Mark Moore a question. We have roadblocks clearly supported by Barry Sweedler to try to intercept the drunk driver, but the police can't set up a roadblock between the kitchen and the bedroom when some man gets a load of alcohol in his system and picks up a club and goes in the bedroom to beat his wife. Is there anything we can do about the role that alcohol seems to play in violence, especially domestic violence?
Well, I think the answer to that is that there seem to be some policy instruments that, if enacted, would reduce the overall level of problems associated with drinking in the society. And in the panel that I had the privilege to chair, we considered 3 different, what we thought of as broadly prevention approaches to dealing with alcohol problems, not only drunk driving, but also domestic assault and murder situations. And the 3 that we had in mind were, on the one hand, affecting the terms and conditions under which alcohol was available, either by the most obvious form of that being raising and lowering taxes, but others having to do with affecting hours of sale and the number of sites, but generally trying to affect the terms and conditions under which alcohol was available. The second was trying to teach people about what constituted safe drinking practices, and doing that partly through the instrument of the criminal law, not only as a specific deterrent to individuals who found themselves exposed to that, but more broadly than that, as a device for educating and licensing, encouraging people to accept in their own minds a responsibility for refraining from the conduct that the law was seeking to deter and proscribe. But also education in the more traditional forms of instruction about what might turn out to be relatively safer or less safe drinking practices. Now, the evidence that we had available indicated that relatively small changes in the price and availability of alcohol could have surprisingly large effects.
Let me press this a moment, because many people come away with our knowledge of American history saying that Prohibition was the noble experiment that failed. We mustn't ever do this again. Yes. We cannot deny people access to something they want. You seem to be saying that if we change the price, perhaps by taxing it, we will reduce the consumption of it. Are you suggesting that in some ways Prohibition may work?
Well, I think that like all economic phenomena, if you raise the price of a commodity, consumption of it goes down, and with that, some portion of the problems associated with consuming it. And we have the evidence that that works from a series of events in states where taxes were raised, and we got reductions in both consumption and cirrhosis and auto fatalities.
I mean, the states in the United States where they raised the taxes on liquor experienced, other things being equal, some reduction in consumption.
Both in consumption, in auto fatalities, and in cirrhosis rates. And that these effects were fairly consistent across states and large enough to be noticeable. And that was a very important finding. And with respect to Prohibition, there was for a long time a conventional view that Prohibition had not reduced the total quantity of alcohol consumption, had in fact increased it in the United States. And while it's always a little bit uncertain, the best current estimates seem to be that Prohibition reduced consumption by about 1/3 in the United States during the period in which it was in effect. That, of course, meant there was a price that the remaining 2/3 that stayed there was now illegal and criminalized, and that's clearly a problem. And nobody, I think, at this stage is the slightest bit interested in going back to Prohibition. But the general idea that we might be able to influence the level and character of the alcohol problem by managing on the supply side of alcohol, I think, has some standing.
It does. Is there anything else we can do dealing with domestic violence or violence that occurs in semi-private places that might reduce the likelihood that somebody will convert alcohol consumption into aggressive behavior?
Well, I think that to the extent that this general supply side strategies reduce total consumption will have an effect there, but that comes at a price of discouraging some perfectly appropriate and legitimate consumption as well. I'm not sure we can do much beyond that to invade homes, but I think that we might be able to have an impact on crimes of violence that are associated with drinking that happen in public. And I think that, as in the case of drunk driving, we have some specific statutes that are designed to remind people that it's dangerous to be drunk in public, dangerous not only because they, like the woman at the beginning of the show, might get angry and commit an offense that they otherwise wouldn't, but also because if you're drunk, you might be victimized. It's much
That's
more...
a good point. Let's come back to this because I want to get back to the notion of drunks as victims. But first I want to ask Dr. Niven, in your position at the National Institute of Alcoholism, you must have reviewed all the evidence as to whether programs of a treatment nature work. We've heard Barry Sweedler talk about law enforcement and Mark Moore talk about changing the supply side of the equation. What about changing the demand side? Can we induce in individuals a lower alcohol consumption by some therapeutic regime?
I think we definitely can for certain groups of alcohol consumers. If you want to take alcoholics for just a moment, who are a significant, but only a portion of those people who are arrested for drunk driving, for example. And if we take all those people and put them in appropriate treatment programs and apply the appropriate treatments for the appropriate length of time, we can change their alcohol consumption behavior with a high degree of reliability and predictability. Unfortunately, we can't do it for everybody at this stage.
What's the key
but
to,
we can do it for
to the
many
treatment
people.
strategy? Is there a particular strategy that seems to work more often than not?
Well, again, focusing on the alcoholic, the strategy that I believe in and virtually all experienced treatment professionals believe in is that the alcoholic needs to learn how not to drink because they have, by definition, impaired, usually grossly impaired ability to control their drinking once they start. So for them, we need to get them to stop drinking. Now, that doesn't necessarily apply to the person who is not an alcoholic, who is what we would call an alcohol abuser, whether that's done regularly or very infrequently. And so we can't say that the same treatments that we apply to the alcoholic successfully are applicable to all people who, for example, again, might be arrested for drunk driving or for committing a crime under
Let
the
me just
influence of
interject
alcohol.
a question with respect to alcoholics. There's mounting evidence from various Scandinavian and other studies that to some degree there's perhaps a genetic predisposition to alcoholism, that it runs in families. Does this tell us anything about how optimistic or pessimistic we can be about changing, or does it give us any clues as to how best to change behavior?
Well, I think it gives us some important clues, and I would agree that there's clear-cut evidence now that alcoholism does run in families. We've known that for a long time, and as one of the people in our field has said, recipes run in families too, and that doesn't necessarily mean that things are inherited, but we do know that there is an inherited component to alcoholism in some individuals, in some families, and I think it does give us some very exciting potential leads that have major prevention implications. We are working very hard from the scientific end to identify those individuals who are at risk, and hopefully we can then apply strategies, prevention strategies to them so that they never get to experience
Might these even be
problems.
chemical strategies? I'm allergic to hay fever. I think I inherited that from my mother. But doctors have provided me with a pill I can take that makes me sneeze less. Is such an outcome with respect to alcoholism even conceivable?
It's quite conceivable. At this stage of our knowledge, I would sort of categorize it as improbable, but it is indeed quite conceivable, and we are conducting some studies to look at that. And the issue of a chemical treatment is also quite conceivable in terms of violence. The whole study of the biochemical basis of violence is really in its infancy. It's just beginning, but it's clear that at least again for some individuals, maybe not for all violent individuals, but for some there are chemical changes that seem to go on in their nervous systems that may be aggravated by alcohol, and if that's the case, there may well be chemicals that we might discover and that individuals might take which might inhibit
Let me get back
behavior.
to a point that Barry Sweedler made, that we have this get-tough attitude in society. The police seem to be making more arrests, though fewer than we sometimes think. In many jurisdictions, the judge will sentence an arrested drunk driver to a treatment program. In your judgment, do the kinds of treatment programs to which people are remanded by a court of value? Are they likely to make a difference?
If the selection is carefully made, I want to emphasize a point that I think was made at the beginning of the show, that this is a complex problem, and it's people who have alcoholism and who drive under the influence and who get arrested for that, and people who apply the treatments. And so there are many variables involved, and I can't say to you that if you take 100 individuals and send them all into the same treatment program for treatment of their alcoholism and their drunk driving, that they're all going to have the same effect. I don't think they will. Some will do better than others. And so matching the patient, the client, the drunk driving offender to the right treatment program and doing the right kind of follow-up therapy, in my view, is critical to successful outcome. I'd also like to add that I think, in my view, the Get Tough approach, while it has some significant potential positive benefits, is not the entire solution, in my view. I think we're never going to solve the drunk driving problem in this country until there's an attitudinal change on the part of the public at large, whether they're drinkers or not, that gets people to not drink alcoholic beverages and engage in driving cars or many other risky behaviors.
Barry, Dr. Niven has said that treatment programs might work, but one has to be very sophisticated about assigning the right kind of person to the right program. Now, is the criminal justice system likely to display that kind of sophistication in making those distinctions and designing those programs?
That's one of the loopholes or shortcomings we found in the total system. It does no good to take an alcoholic and put him in a program where he goes one night a week for a month to learn about alcohol education. And on the other side, it does no good to take a person who's been caught for the first time, a social drinker, so to speak, and put him in a year-long program to try to cure his alcohol problem. The big problem comes from two things. You have judges who are not educated properly to understand what they should be doing, and you don't have the records system that can, even if the judges wanted to give the right, or had the knowledge to give the right type of sentence, the records still wouldn't indicate that. You need an assessment of each person after they're convicted before the sentence is made. And one thing we feel very strongly about, treatment is fine, but the sentencing must come first. Punishment must come first. We do not feel that you should substitute treatment for punishment. Punishment should come first, but the treatment must be done too if you're going to solve the long-term problem.
Does this, Dr. Niven, worry you that the punishment must come first if the treatment is to follow later?
Even if it's taking the license away?
Well, I wouldn't agree with that in the general way in which it's stated. I think that may well be true for some individuals, but not necessarily true for others. I've seen individuals who've gotten successfully treated for their alcoholism and don't drink and drive anymore who've never had any punishment applied, and there's some people to whom we apply punishment and treatment and they don't get better, and there's many people in between. It is, again, a very complex issue with many variables which influence both identification and referral and treatment outcome.
A complexity that Mark Moore mentioned earlier is the fact that the criminal justice system takes the assaulter or the murderer and, as I understand it, doesn't pay much attention to whether they've been drinking or their past record of drinking. They're focused on the crime, the robbery, the assault, their murder. Now, is it right to take that approach when, over on the other side, the system is trying to make these distinctions when it comes to drunk driving, treatment and punishment combined in some way? Are there any lessons we can learn from the drunk driving strategy that might apply to the assault and violent crime strategy?
Well, I think they are, and they have to do with integrating the two different perspectives of sort of punishment and treatment. And there's an issue in the law about whether alcohol is a mitigating or an aggravating factor in actual criminal offenses. And the conventional wisdom is that alcohol has been treated as a mitigating factor when the person has gone on to commit an additional offense, as in a drunken assault or a robbery.
By mitigating, you mean we take the offense less seriously because they've been drinking, is that right?
Yes, and we take it less seriously because the moral judgment that would ordinarily be rendered if the person were sober and committed an act, all right, seems to be less strong in the case that the person is confused because, as the lady at the beginning of the show indicated, a fleeting thought that would not be characteristic of her ordinarily got translated into an action, and therefore we feel a little less comfortable about holding her fully responsible for the act. Nonetheless, we typically do that, and I think that the actual amount of mitigation that is held out when people commit crimes under the influence of alcohol is not very great. On the other hand...
And you don't think it should be great?
I don't think it should be great. On the other hand, we say to the person who's drinking, there are some... We make it an offense all by itself to drive drunken or to be drunk in public, all right? Regardless of whether there is an actual violent outcome of that. And the reason is that we are telling people we depend on you to keep yourself in a state where you can be responsible for your action. All right? And so the offense in those particular cases is willfully putting yourself in a state where you can no longer quite be held responsible for your actions.
Sort of like selling yourself into slavery. We make that illegal.
That's right.
On the public drunkenness point, before we leave that,
yes.
It was my understanding that in most jurisdictions, being drunk in public is no longer itself an offense. And if the police see somebody that is simply drunk, unless there's a treatment program they can induce him to participate in, they can't do anything. Is that a wrong change in the law?
Well, I'm not sure that we have the evidence yet to indicate whether it's wrong or not. I think that in my understanding of the laws in most states is that they still do allow the police to take somebody into protective custody for a period of time if they seem to be intoxicated enough in a way that puts them or others at risk associated with it. As a practical matter, I also have the impression that the police end up dealing with drunken people because they're the only people who are on the streets, the only public agency that are on the streets at that time. So I think we could say that while we may have gotten rid of criminal statutes that held people, or in some states may have gotten rid of criminal statutes that made it a crime to be drunk in public, it nonetheless is being managed by the police as a public health hazard.
I just saw some statistics recently which showed that in one large county in the metropolitan area, outside of metropolitan area, the #1 reason for a police arrest was drunk in public, and followed very closely by drunken driving, arrest for drunken driving. In fact, drunken driving has been reported to be the #1 violent crime committed in this country.
I think if I could just interject an additional comment on this issue, that to the extent that decriminalizing public intoxication is not accompanied by programs to deal with public intoxication, then I think it is a problem, because one of the things that we tend to not remember is that putting intoxicated people in jail served a positive effect, I think. It helped get those people often in an environment that was somewhat protective and tended to help them, as well as potentially removing them from being in a crime-involving kind of situation. And the goal, really, of both of them, I think, is not very dissimilar. The idea is to minimize the impact on the drunken person and on the public of intoxication.
One last comment.
I think it did one more thing than that, and I think this is important. It also had the effect of reminding people that it was wrong to be drunk in public, as well as produce all these utilitarian. And I think there's an important necessity of keeping the idea that we need to remind people of their responsibilities along with help them achieve them as part of our policy in this area.
Thank you for joining me on this subject, gentlemen. And ladies and gentlemen there, thank you for joining us here for Crime File. I'm James Wilson.
Funding for this program was provided by the National Institute of Justice. This program was produced by the Police Foundation, which is solely responsible for its content.